Thank you, Daniel. That was wonderful. And to introduce our speaker today, we have Peter Miller.
Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce a longtime friend and comrade in arms in the climate action, Curt Hull. Curt is the project director of Climate Change Connection, as you've heard, which is an outstanding resource for understanding the science, impacts, and possible responses to a changing climate. Climate Change Connection is our share of the plate partner for April, and Curt, I believe, will say a bit more about his own journey and the organization that he leads. I want to point out that Curt's talk this morning is part one of today's UU celebration of Earth Day, sponsored by the Social Justice Green Action Team. Governments around the world have committed to creating a carbon neutral economy by 2015. Curt will provide an overview of what that entails for Manitoba. Shortly after the service ends at noon, Curt will be joined by two more special guests to explore pathways to zero carbon buildings with our church as a case study. Our other guests are Colleen Kurlick, CEO of Efficiency Manitoba, and Dudley Thompson, whose firm Prairie Architects designed the building we now enjoy. I hope many of you will hang around in the church and on Zoom for the afternoon session. And now, Curt, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to just open up my computer here and hopefully share a presentation with you. There we are. So what I'm proposing to do here in my presentation is maybe give you a bit of an outline of what a pathway to a fossil fuel-free, climate-resilient future looks like in Manitoba, because in one of the earlier speakers was talking about active hope, and that was very inspiring, and I hopefully I can embrace that active hope idea, because there's a lot of ideas in here that should be put into action and I think are practical. But what brings me to this place, and Peter invited me to share a bit of my backstory. This is me in the 80s when I had a different barber. I'm an engineer, and still an engineer, do some work for the Association Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, and I have had a career in manufacturing, 25 or more years in manufacturing. And throughout that time, raising my family, I was happy to do that. But then in 2006, I went to the movies downtown. There's a lot of nodding heads here. There are some people that have seen this movie, because this movie had a profound effect on my life. After seeing that movie, I was profoundly disturbed. I had some idea about climate change, but this really sort of put everything into focus for me. And that focus was really centered on these people. There's my sons and my daughter and her family and my granddaughters. And the future that is in store for them is what is a consequence of the action we take now. And currently, the pathway's not the brightest. It needs a lot of action that's different than what we're doing right now. So within 8 months of seeing that movie, I was doing something very different. I started work for Climate Change Connection within 6 months of seeing that, 6 or 8 months. And I've been working for 16 years. This is my colleague Susan, and she and I have been working together on climate change education and solutions over the course of that time. She's been focusing on supporting youth and educators, and I've been working with policy, primarily with organizations on policy, the dry stuff, but it really think it's important. And I saw that movie, Al Gore's movie, and I actually have had an opportunity to meet with him, and I'm on the board of Climate Reality Canada, have been for the last few years. But Climate Change Connection is also part of a broader group called the Climate Action Team. There's 5 different organizations, you can see them named at the bottom there, that have been working together unofficially for quite some time, but just since around 2018 or so, we started to work together officially. As a consequence of some work that we did after the province's Climate and Green Plan came out in 2017, these organizations, we said, this doesn't seem to have had a lot of community input. It needs more community input. And so we had a town hall at the University of Winnipeg in late 2017, and we had roundtables and discussion groups and scribes and facilitators and everything. We gathered all this information, and we said, well, this is great, but what are we going to do with it? So immediately we started to work on putting it all together. And in 2021, we published this document, Manitoba's Road to Resilience. And it provides a pathway, a framework for that pathway. As soon as we released it, we started work on the next volume, which is focused on the energy challenge. I'll get into some of the details here. And then as soon as we published it in 2022, we started work on policy solutions. And we've just this past Thursday released the first of 3 modules on the policy solutions. And within that document, don't bother reading this here, but there are 11 policy solutions here that are all available, and you can access them through the Climate Action Team website, which is climateactionmb.ca. And so there are lots of reading and lots of detail that you can acquire at that website. Download the PDFs, etc. But it's all centered on the ideas that came from this document here. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released this document that we call the 1.5 report. What it contains is a scientific review of the literature that tells us what would be the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial and 2 degrees of warming in terms of consequence. How much more severe is that? But also, and more importantly from my perspective, what is needed in order to achieve either one of those? And I'm not going to bore you with a lot of graphs, but there's 2 that are really important. This one here shows the average annual temperature of the planet. The squiggly stuff on the left is the instrument records and the actual records from about 1960 through till nearly the present day. And the average is kind of going up linearly. And according to the actions that we're taking currently, the greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere, that straight line is going to continue into the future unless we do things differently. And so the report was talking about how do we bend that curve? How do we change it from going linearly into really dangerous and destructive territory, and rather to bend it down to a point where it levels out by the end of the century, somewhere in that gray area, depending on our actions. And so what actions does it prescribe? Well, of course, it's focused on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. And this is a really important document and or graph, and it's the graph that led all of the research that we've been doing since we saw it. Because if you look at it, it says that the greenhouse gas emissions from human activity needs to reduce precipitously in order to achieve that flattening of the curve that you saw in the previous graph. And basically, it shows that we need to cut our emissions in half approximately by 2030 and achieve 0 by 2050. That's where all the talk is about. If you're listening to the news, people talk about 2050. That's where that number comes from, is from this graph. And then after 2050, we have to be actively extracting carbon from the atmosphere at a really ponderous rate. This is a really challenging graph, and it tells us a really challenging story. But it didn't go on deaf ears necessarily, because there was a watershed moment in 2015. The Paris Accord, the Paris Climate Accord, ultimately achieved agreement amongst all of the countries of the world that said that we need to move away from a reliance on fossil fuels and move to a net zero future. We took that home, the Canadian delegation took that home, and a year later came out with the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. And this is actually where the carbon tax came from, and a lot of other funding opportunities that the federal government has been undertaking. A year after that, the provincial government came up with the Climate and Green Plan that I mentioned about the town hall. This is the document that was released. And then the city of Winnipeg got on board a year later with their climate action plan. Now, unfortunately, except for some funding opportunities from the federal government, there hasn't been a lot of action, really concerted or at least necessary action at the necessary level from the provincial or the city so far. With one exception at the city in 2022, July 2022, the city government adopted this document, the Community Energy Investment Roadmap, and it provides a pathway very similar to what we came up with in the Road to Resilience. It was really nice to see that parallel thinking from a slightly different perspective. This one is what some of us, Dudley and I and others, are trying to encourage the city to take seriously. It was adopted by council, and they need to be implementing it. Because there's a lot of concern out there, especially amongst young people. I, as an engineer and a mentor, I come in contact with undergraduate engineers and youth, and they're freaking out, rightfully so. There's some that are to the point where it's really a panic situation for them. And the youth aren't alone. Luckily, it was really inspiring in 2019 to stand amongst between 12 and 15,000 Manitobans who were concerned about climate change and marched around between the ledge and the forks and back and showed that this is a concern for us all. Okay, so we're concerned, but I don't like to live in the world of concern. I prefer to live in the world of solution, and especially numbers, so putting numbers to the solution. That's where the engineering comes in and the why I brought it up. So we produced this Road to Resilience. What's it all about? It's about resilience. And when I speak about resilience, there's a number of ways to think about resilience, but I think about it in terms of being able to meet our essential needs ourselves without fossil fuels. Okay? Great. What are our essential needs? Well, in a nutshell, we need to be able to feed ourselves without fossil fuel-based fertilizer and without diesel for the machinery. We need to be able to heat all of our buildings, old and new, without fossil gas, natural gas. And we need to be able to move all goods and people without gasoline or diesel. That, in a nutshell, is the challenge, and we need to use our electrical resource and other energy sources as effectively and efficiently as we can in order to meet those technical challenges. But as we take on those technical challenges, we need to be respectful of and pay attention to the foundational concerns that go along with that. And these, by the way, are the chapters in the Road to Resilience. There's ideas and suggestions in all of these different topic areas. So as we make our way to those solutions, those technical solutions, we have to make sure that we do it in a way that's affordable for everyone. That it's not, we don't put the burden on people, but we also provide green jobs. We provide good opportunities for employment for people. We have to be respectful of the human impacts of climate change, both culturally, generationally. I talked about the young people freaking out. They didn't cause the problem, but they're going to have to live with the consequence. Poverty, people that are poor often are the most affected without contributing, and geographically as well, the people in the south versus the people in the north. And finally, we need to make room for natural spaces. We have to maintain natural spaces and places for species other than ourselves. Those are all part of the solutions. So I'm going to just very briefly, because we've only got a few minutes, just give you some ideas here about solution, so that maybe in our conversation afterwards we can dip into at least the buildings portion more fully. When it comes to food and agriculture, really the primary theme here. There's a couple of primary themes. One of them is local, and the other one is nutrient recycling. So local food, this is a picture from the Sustainable South Osborne folks that have turned the grass on Churchill Drive into a garden. Exactly, it's very inspiring. And along the way, besides producing food, they've produced community. There's people, multi-generations, are all contributing to the production of the food, sharing of the food. Very healthy way to provide food. And there's also producers that there's an agriculture that make a living at producing food, and we need to support them. We can support them through these kinds of farmers markets. This is the one in Lord Roberts, or customer-supported agriculture, where you directly connect to a producer and you get a basket of seasonal vegetables or produce on a weekly or monthly basis. And conceptually, agriculture is moving to a different way of farming. It's called regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of aspects to it. I'm not going to go into the details, but you can see the 5 key ideas here. So in agriculture needs to move in a different direction, but yet still maintain the profit for the producers. We have to be conscious of that. Don't put the burden on individuals nor on individual farmers. But in the growing of our own food, making use of household composting or commercial composting. This machine here, this is an in-vessel composter at the Forks. This is all of the restaurants at the Forks actually take their organic waste and take it across that footbridge over to the south side of the Assiniboine River and turn that organic waste into soil. And there have been some attempts at agricultural composting. Overton, there's some other companies that are working on this here, but it's not been accepted hugely. So food and agriculture, we talked about that one briefly. These next topics are the ones that became that second Road to Resilience document, the Road to Resilience Energy Solutions, trying to assess whether or not we can heat our buildings and fuel our vehicles electrically. And what we did was we put numbers to the problem. How big is that problem? How much power and how much energy would be required in order to do that? We got numbers from hydro. In 2018, Manitoba Hydro produced a thing called the Load Forecast Report. And that's the red band that you see at the bottom there. Those were the numbers of required power to heat buildings and charge vehicles electrically. And the other one is energy. What's the difference? Power is instantaneous. So if you've got a small heater, it might be 1,000 kilowatts. So that's power, 1,000 kilowatts. And if you leave it on for an hour, it uses 1,000 kilowatt hours of energy. Energy is an integral over time. So what you see here is the biggest challenge is the peak, that column there that says hydro was able to deliver 4750 in the year 2017-18, but the load forecast says that we would need an additional 200% more power and about 100% more energy. Can we do that? That's what we put together in the Road to Resilience Energy Solutions. We said, is this possible? And if so, how? And we said, let's try to do it without nuclear and without building new dams in the north. Is it possible? Well, we put the numbers together, and you can read about the numbers that we propose in the Road to Resilience Energy Solutions tables. But there's 5 sort of key areas. Primarily, we want to use more of the energy that we produce right here in the province rather than exporting it. We still are conscious of the need to be interconnected and share in times of need, when low water years, etc. But this, number 2, is the big one. Deep retrofits, making our buildings as efficient as possible, the new ones and the old ones, connecting them to district geothermal. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Solar power is a slight portion of the solution, but it doesn't help that power challenge. The power challenge is, there's a day in the future when it's 35 below, it's middle of January, 6 o'clock in the morning, the sun's not up, and everybody is warming up their houses and making toast. That's the biggest challenge right there, being able to, and especially if that lasts for 2 or 3 weeks. That's the biggest challenge that we've been focusing on. Solar's not going to contribute a huge amount to that unless we've got a lot of storage included. So wind, and then we did we did analyze battery storage. We're going to talk just about the concepts. So first of all, I'm going to go quickly here through the first idea, which is when we build new buildings, we have to make them as efficient as possible. This building here is the first certified passive house in Manitoba. And did you design this one, Dudley? No, it wasn't your company, but Dudley's had a hand in some other high-performance buildings, making sure that new buildings are require as little energy as possible. This one is near Gimli. And now there's the 2020 Energy Code, which is very helpful for new buildings. We got to make our buildings as efficient as possible. We have to retrofit buildings. And we can do it this way. This is Sun Certified Builders does it on the exterior of the building. I'm not going to go into the details. Very time-consuming and expensive. The National Research Council is experimenting with computer modeling and factory-built panels. And then, so you make the envelope of the building as efficient as possible, but then you make your heating of that building as efficient as possible. It's electric now, it's not fossil gas, it's electric, and there's a lot of talk about air source heat pumps, and they will save you money over time, but they won't help that 6 o'clock in the morning, it's 35 below problem. Because at 35 below, an air source heat pump is the same as a baseboard heater. It's a coefficient of 1, okay? So what we instead need is ground source heat pumps, geothermal. And not just geothermal, you or I ripping up our yards, but we're talking about it shared in neighborhoods or in districts or in municipalities, engineered to provide that utility, and we're proposing it as a utility. Just the same as the fossil gas system was implemented as a utility, geothermal should be done the same way. Designed, implemented, and managed by a utility. And we just pay to connect and the usage of it. And we need to take this on in the same way as we did in World War II. It needs to be centrally coordinated and managed, and not just you or I making funding applications, but rather a central climate emergency secretariat managing all of the utilities, crown corporations and businesses to move us towards that solution. The second one is transportation, and we need to, first of all, if we can, if we don't need to travel, don't travel. That's the cheapest way to go. And we've had a lot of practice in the last couple of years on that. There's opportunities potentially for shorter trips using active transportation. And Winnipeg's gotten better since 2007. Things have been improving, especially since 2010, but we still have some way to go. And it is only a portion of the solution. It only works on short trips. Using public transit, and public transit that actually is designed to provide frequent service. And I'm really happy about the Winnipeg Transit Master Plan, and it needs to be implemented. And what it will do is, the map you see on the left is the number of frequent service routes that currently exist in the network. The proposal in the master plan is the purple or blue on the right-hand side. Those are the frequent service routes. And what we would do is, with the implementation of that plan, go from having 21% of dwellings currently within 500 meters walk of frequent service, but after this implementation, 58% of dwellings would be within 500 meters of frequent service. Frequent service meaning a bus is going to come every 10 minutes. Then you now have a utility rather than just something to get you to work and back. You would actually use it instead of a vehicle. And if you did need a vehicle, car share. The Peg City Car Co-op is a success story for Winnipeg. I haven't owned a car since 2008. And I use these mechanisms. I've been a member of CarShare since it started. And when I do need a car for groceries or something like that, I just book it and use it for the hour or so that I need it. But electrification is a big part of this story for vehicle transportation. And it is coming. It's inevitable. Why do I say that? Well, because of this graph here. This is the last graph that I'm going to share with you. but it has to do with the cost of manufacture of these things. The cost of manufacture of an internal combustion engine vehicle that has 500-kilometer range goes up basically because of inflation. The cost of production of a similar range electric vehicle has been coming down exponentially. This graph was produced in 2017 and predicted that those two curves would cross somewhere around 2023-24. It's interesting, this was 2017 when this came out, and those two, the prediction was that was 2023 when those two curves would cross. Now, we may not see that in the showroom, but from the manufacturer's perspective, this is inevitable primarily because there are so many fewer parts and so much less precision required for an electric vehicle versus an internal combustion engine vehicle running at the efficiencies and miles per gallon kind of situation and pollution controls as they have right now. So this is really attractive to all of the manufacturers of these vehicles. That's why I say this is inevitable. And you can see the race for this amongst those manufacturers starting up really and heating up right now. So not just for passenger cars, but the City of Winnipeg is undertaking a study now to 100 sustainable or clean energy vehicles, which is a mixture of electric and hydrogen. Interesting project. I've been in touch with Erin Cook, the manager of this project. She knows what she's doing. Other vehicles like the F-150 is on the market today. School buses. This bus is produced in Quebec. Wouldn't it be great, if you walk your kids or your grandkids to school, how smelly it is next to the school, and if you're sitting in the bus and it's idling and it's got the diesel fumes, this thing is electric, and built in Quebec. And also semi-trucks. This was announced a few years ago, and technically it's there, and economically it works for the owner of this vehicle. This is a commercial vehicle that needs to make money for the operator. It's just a matter of production capability and capacity in order to make it happen. So the final topic is energy and electricity, providing that electricity. I talked briefly about the hydro exports. I've learned since we produced this document in 2022, we've got more information about it. We were able to meet that need in a very short window of time, but if we look at it over the course of the year, we still need to be tied into other grids elsewhere. That's a lot of details there. But we do need more wind. We in our current iteration of our analysis, we require about 3,500 megawatts. That's a pretty big number, considering we only have 260 megawatts in the two farms we got right now. So we said, holy smokes, that's quite a bit more. But interestingly enough, currently Ontario's got 5,400, and North Dakota has already got in place 3,000. So this is doable. Okay? As I mentioned before, solar plays a part, but not as, like a lot of people generate towards or gravitate towards rooftop solar, but it's not meeting that middle of the winter, the sun's not up yet, power challenge. It's part, but not the whole story. Interesting, some technology. You can use the car battery, which is also a load, but it can also be a source of power. It's called vehicle to grid, because you got this big old battery, and it could provide that load shaving kind of power. There's also technologies for at-home battery storage, and if you've got differential time of day costing, you could use that power to charge your vehicle when you needed to or whatever. But one thing that we found is thermal storage. Very interesting need here couple it with the geothermal. I'm not going to go into the details, but basically, if you look at this chart here, it says that 50% of our solution is needs to be achieved through our buildings, making our buildings more efficient. That's the big number that you want us to look at there. And that's what I've been focusing my time on. And we did some projections into the future. It actually is much more difficult we can meet the current challenge, replace the heating of buildings and the fueling of vehicles electrically with our current sort of population and size. But if we keep growing the way that we have, we now think that we can't continue to grow in the same way as we have been. MPI says we add 1.5% to the number of vehicles every year. We can't keep doing that, electric or not. we can't provide for that. So in a nutshell, I try to keep to some reasonable amount of time. This is my story, and hopefully we can carry on the conversation after the break.
Thank you so much, Curt. That was really interesting and really wonderful.